Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. My name is Chris Johnson. I'm the Freeman Chair in China Studies here at CSIS. I want to thank everyone for joining us today on this discussion on Taiwan-U.S. Japan trilateral relations. I'm going to just take a moment here to introduce our speakers, and then we'll get right into it. I'm going to start off with Vice Admiral Masanori Yoshida, who joined the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Forces in 1979 as a graduate of the National Defense Academy, where he served mainly on surface ships as an operations officer. He has over 35 years of professional and managerial experience in the maritime defense and security area, and his offshore duties have included serving at the Programming Generation Center, which developed anti-submarine warfare systems as part of the Aegis program, and serving 6 times at the Maritime Staff Office of the Ministry of Defense, where he was in charge of welfare, education, operations, and intelligence. He also served as defense attaché in Japan's U.S. Embassy, and his final government assignment was a commander of the Sasebo Regional Command. He joined Sojin's Corporation of America, Washington, D.C.'s office in July of 2015 as Vice President, International Security Affairs. My colleague, Dr. Michael J. Green, is Senior Vice President for Asia and Japan Chair here at CSIS and Director of Asian Studies at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. He served on the staff of the National Security Council from 2001 through 2005, first as Director for Asian Affairs with responsibility for Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, and then as Special Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs and Senior Director for Asia with responsible for both East Asia and South Asia. Before joining the NSC staff, he was a Senior Fellow for East Asian Security at the Council of Foreign Relations, Director of the Edmund O. Reischauer Center and the Foreign Policy Institute, and Assistant Professor at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University, Research Staff Member at the Institute for Defense Analyses, and Senior Advisor on Asia in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. He also worked in Japan on the staff of a member of the National Diet. And finally, we have Michael Fonte. Mike is the Washington liaison for the Democratic Progressive Party of Taiwan. As information liaison between Taiwan's DPP and policymakers in Washington. Formerly, he was the senior policy analyst for the Formosan Association for Public Affairs from 1999 to 2002, where he was responsible for tracking U.S. policy toward Taiwan security issues, and developments in Taiwanese political affairs, and producing opinion pieces, journal articles, and a member newsletter on these questions. And so obviously we've got a lot of expertise here in the room today, and so we're going to get right to it. Thank you. Michael Green, we're going to start with you. You've obviously thought a lot about the Asia security issue in preparation for your fantastic book, By More Than Provenance, which I highly recommend to anyone who wants to understand U.S. foreign policy in this area. And a key observation, of course, from your book was the sort of tension in U.S. foreign policy toward the region between approaching Asia from a maritime point of view and from a continental point of view. Today, obviously, we're very much in the maritime space with what we're looking at. So could you sort of, through that strategic lens, give us your sense of setting the stage here, how we should be thinking about this, what strategic imperatives these 3 countries face from your point of view, and how we should be thinking about that just as a general frame of reference.
Sure, thank you. Thank you all for coming. The book's coming out in Japanese and Chinese at the end of the year. Korean next month if you want. You can read it in all 4 languages. Hopefully it will be the same. Japan-Taiwan relations today are in quite good shape, actually, for a variety of political and strategic and economic reasons. In the book, I wrote a history of U.S. Strategic thinking about Asia since the American Revolution, and there was strategic thinking, actually, even in the Federalist Papers. And one of the themes that came out when I did my research and wrote the book was that while there are many different views about Asia, within the U.S. there's often been a debate about whether our strategic interests are better served by aligning with maritime powers, particularly Japan, but also Australia or India and Taiwan, or whether our interests are better served by aligning with or forming a condominium with China. And there's logic historically to both. China is the center of Asian order historically. A weak China for the United States was bad in the 19th and 20th centuries because it would draw in other powers. But the contrary view was, no, we're a maritime power. The Pacific is critical to our security. And the logical alignment for us is with the other maritime powers. And this is not a new debate. This goes back to the 1850s in the American case with Commodore Perry, who opened Japan. His counterpart in China, the commissioner in China, was a guy named Humphrey Marshall, who was from a landlocked state, Kentucky, cavalryman, Army versus Navy. You see where this is going. And Humphrey Marshall argued in the 1850s the U.S. should help the Chinese stop Russian and British imperialism and deal with the Taiping. And so these two visions were evident in their letters back and in speeches. Mahan came back in 1853 and in the 55, 56 gave speeches saying in the future the U.S. will secure its position in the Pacific by aligning with Japan and Britain. So it's kind of the free and open Indo-Pacific 150 years early. And you know, you've seen that kind of division for some time. Even at the beginning of the Trump administration, people were wondering whether Taiwan would be a pawn, whether President Trump would try to strike a grand bargain with China. I think that's probably behind us now, and the U.S. position appears to be captured by the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, which was written in Japan. Japan also has this historic division. Sorry to get a little historical, but you know, also in the in this case, 1860s and 70s, around the same time Mahan was making these arguments and Commodore Perry, Japan had its own debate, where the Satsuma, who created the Navy, said we are a maritime power. And the Choshu, which basically created the Army, said, let's swallow China. First, let's swallow Korea, then let's swallow China. Yamagata Aritomo had this famous line about Japan's line of advantage about where Japan had to be in Korea or China to defend itself and not let other powers dominate China. And the Navy, historically, historically has generally been more aligned to Britain, America, the maritime powers, with one very important exception in World War II. And you know, just as the U.S. has shifted very much towards back to really this maritime view, so has Japan. In the Cold War, in what's called the 1955 system, the Liberal Democratic Party, the mainstream was, especially after Japan normalized relations with China in 1972, the mainstream was all about China. Keep a good alliance with the U.S. and then maintain a balance by close ties to China. Always be closer to China than the U.S. is. When the LDP collapsed, that mainstream view flipped, and from Prime Minister Koizumi to today, every Japanese prime minister has been what once was called the anti-mainstream, which is much more pro-Taiwan, more maritime. And so you've had this flip. And then in Taiwan, which Mike will know much better, you know, before democratization, the view of Japan was pretty positive, but with the DPP, with democratization, the DPP has kind of aligned quite a bit with this Abe maritime view. When I was in the NSC, I could not go to Yasukuni Shrine for obvious reasons, so I was curious to go. In 2006, when I left the NSC and was a private citizen, and I walked to Yasukuni Shrine, and you usually see the old Imperial Japanese rising sun flag, but to my surprise, when I walked in, there was a DPP flag flying, which proves the old adage, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, because of course the DPP on most issues is much more closely aligned with Japan's opposition party, nuclear power, the economy. But on this one, big strategic questions, the DPP kind of aligns pretty well with Abe. So you have the US, Japan, Taiwan, all kind of aligning, but, and then I'll end, I mean, there are some obstacles. I think for Japan, there's frustration with Taiwan over the fact that Taiwan will not import food from Fukushima, where the nuclear crisis happened, which hurts the feelings, I think, of a lot of Japanese. Taiwan's position on Okinawa-Torishima and other territorial issues aligns with Beijing's. That's frustrating. I think from Taiwan's side, there's some frustration. I think the current former self-defense force officers are quite interactive, but the current government of Japan is very careful. I think there's more intel sharing, more Coast Guard cooperation, but still, despite the alignment, rather cautious. And then both sides, both Taipei and Tokyo, are wondering what's happening in Washington. And I'll leave it at that. That even though you have this free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, which I think is consistent and has consensus throughout the cabinet, Mattis, McMaster, Tillerson, there are aspects that don't conform with a free and open Indo-Pacific, like leaving TPP.
Right.
So that's kind of how I describe the dynamics.
Great, thank you. And we'll come back to the Indo-Pacific piece here in a moment. So let's fast forward a little bit to the current picture then, Admiral Yoshida. Obviously, Prime Minister Abe is clearly, in the strongest political position domestically of any Japanese prime minister for a long time. How do you think that shapes, if it does at all, Tokyo's relationship with Taiwan? How do you think it impacts our discussions between the U.S. and Japan? And to Mike's point about sort of Prime Minister Abe's maritime focus, maybe you can comment on that, given your own background.
Yeah, thank you very much for giving opportunity to today. So already you introduced to my background, the military. So the little bit my out of expertise today. but my final assignment of the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Forces was a commander in the southwestern region of Japan. The western end of my area of responsibility was located about 100 kilometers from Taiwan. Due to the political and diplomatic relationship with China, I was never able to visit Taiwan during active duty. That's very symbolic. For many countries, the relations with Taiwan has been dependent on politics for China. However, Taiwan now has its own strategic importance as the region power balance has changed dramatically over the past decade. It is essential for Taiwan to maintain a political and security autonomy for the peace and stability of the region. Taiwan must not overly depend economically or socially only on specific countries. It is also extremely important that Taiwan acts locally as the defender of the existing regional order based on freedom and democracy. To that end, Taiwan must constantly expand and deepen relationship with partners that share its values and benefits, including Japan and the United States. The Abe administration clearly recognized Taiwan's unique strategic value, and Prime Minister Shinzo Abe also emphasized the relationship with Taiwan. Shinzo Abe's strong position as Prime Minister is a great advantage for Japan to advance such efforts. Taiwan's efforts in coordination with the United States is also indispensable. It's my view.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Mike, continuing on the sort of historical theme, perhaps you can sort of give us a lens from the Taiwan domestic political point of view. Obviously, we've had several democratic elections now and changes in government between the KMT position and the DPP position. But it's been interesting to see that in all Taiwan governments, it's been a fairly warm feeling toward Japan and in general toward the relationship. So how do you see that from not only the Taiwan perspective, but then how do you kind of nest that, if you will, in your sense of the strategic environment from Taiwan's point of view?
Well, it's very important. Thanks very much for the opportunity. I think the first thing to say is Taiwan sees itself as an island nation, so I think that's an important element of the maritime strategy. It's also true, a very big difference between the Ma administration and the classic KMT position, which is someday China's going to get its act together to be together, and we're going to be there, okay? Right. The DPP, Tsai administration says, hello, we've developed ourselves as a significant, sovereign, independent country. We want to stay that way. So that's the tension. And I think what the difference is, President Ma looked basically west to China as part of a continental, shall we say, whereas Tsai looks north to Japan, east to the United States, and south to that whole arc. The whole Southbound Policy is from India all the way through. But there's a really very different kind of feeling tone, and I guess I would want to put this little anecdote in there. I went to Taiwan in 1967, a long time ago. I had two teachers I studied Taiwanese, two teachers, both of whom had graduated from Waseda University. They were in their 50s. They had lived through the end of the Japanese colonial period into the period of KMT rule. So while Professor Masuda, I think last time we were talked about it's a nostalgic feeling for Japan. It's partially nostalgic, but it's also a visceral response to the KMT rule in Taiwan and a kind of a comparison. My teachers would say, the Japanese were strict, but they were fair. Here's the rules. You go by the rules, and things will be okay. It wasn't all copacetic during that period, but there was a lot of opportunity for Taiwanese. They went to school in Japan, some of them. There was the Home Rule movement where there was opportunities. So they looked at that, and then they looked when the KMT came, and all hell had broken loose. There were no rules. Everything was up for grabs, et cetera. So I think the kimochi between Taiwan and Japan comes from a very different, for the older generation, a very different view. The younger generation has another set of feelings. The pop cultural links, right? There's that. There's a visiting back and forth. There's a lot of sense that Japan is really our friend. When the earthquake took place recently, Japan offered a lot of assistance, emergency crews. There's a famous picture, and you've probably seen Prime Minister Abe spent some time apparently getting his characters right, and he do Jiayo, right? Go Taiwan. I mean, this is feeling tone stuff, which makes a big difference. So I think that's the way I think you can see how Taiwan wants to fit itself into the regional order, be part of this maritime consortium, shall we say, and be a regional player as has been mentioned, who's really adding something to the game. There are hiccups that Mike already mentioned, the food issue, the Yokinatori, the Senkaku Diaoyutais. I think on the Senkaku Diaoyutai issue, DPP certainly feels like they are part of the geological link, but responsibility is first and foremost to good relations with Japan. So they're trying to work things out. Okinatori is another question which we could get into, but I think that what you see is a real drive on the part of the DPP to have very good relations with Japan and with the rest of the arc that I talked about.
And in fact, just to follow up on that, I remember, on the islands issue in particular, there was some sense because when Ma Ying-jeou was in, because he'd done some academic work on the issue and so on, that this would somehow, affect his sort of thinking. Yet he, to your point, he sort of stuck with that traditional KMT position, very, very strongly. So
he did. Some of the DPP people would say he kind of leaned a little bit more China's way on some issues, whether he was supportive of boats coming out of Hong Kong. There were questions. I don't know what true or false. But the point is, I think there's a very different mood now with the DPP. One of the problems DPP has is they have a lot of fishing boats going out of their turf, and they're Taiwanese, so they like to duck into the territory and duck out, right? and the Japanese patrols are always trying to water hose a bunch of people the other day.
Right.
Well, these were people who came from Taiwan. They went in the EEZ. They were chased out. They came back the next day, and they were purposely pushing the envelope. So you never know in Taiwan. There's a lot of retained KMT influence who want to push a little bit on the Japanese. There's some United Front activity, so I'm never quite sure how to read that. But so everything's not entirely 100% right, but I think the fundamental push of the DPP is to be part of that regional order.
That makes sense. And while we're talking about the regional order, like you mentioned the Indo-Pacific Strategy, of course, in your opening comments and its deep roots. I guess I had sort of two questions. I mean, one is your general assessment of it as a strategy. Sounds like from your earlier comments you're generally supportive. From your perspective, strategically, how should the U.S. be thinking about integrating Japan and Taiwan to the degree we're able, given the constraints we have in the relationship, into that strategy? And then I know, of course, for you and for me, and I think a lot of other observers, and you mentioned it with TPP, how do we exercise this strategy when it's absent a trade component? And especially when we're talking about partners like Japan, like Taiwan, where trade is security for them, in short.
Well, the Free and Open Indo-Pacific Strategy was originally a Japanese, literally taken out of a Japanese policy planning document. But the intellectual roots go back to American thinkers like Mahan and Perry, and so it really is kind of a common destiny, if you will, or a common DNA in Japanese and U.S. and Taiwanese thinking about strategy in the Pacific and China. the national security strategy document that came out from the White House was pretty rough in declaring China a revisionist power and lumping it with Russia. I thought it was intellectually honest in the sense that every national security strategy since the Cold War, including ones I worked on, assume a great power condominium or cooperation around terrorism or climate change or whatever the flavor of the presidency is. This one was honest in saying we're in an era of great power rivalry. But I think it's a little bit too simple in some ways. It was good they framed it that way, frankly, rather than sort of being blindsided and reacting, which I think to some extent the previous administration did on this problem. But China's not a revisionist power like Russia.
Right.
And to the extent it is a revisionist power, it's within Asia, not globally, which is kind of what we did in the 19th century. If you ask Mexico, was America a revisionist power in the 19th century, they'd say yes. Of course, it's the 21st century, so the rules should be a little stricter. The problem with making it a little too black and white is it puts everybody, even Japan, in a somewhat awkward position, including Taiwan, which is far more dependent on the mainland of China for trade than the US or Japan now. So that lack of nuance was a problem. I think TPP was an important part of the solution because TPP created a rule-making body or group of countries that put pressure on China to open its own market. And as you know well, Chris, that within China, here and other reform-oriented economic experts were going to use TPP to try to push changes within China. Without TPP, it even in a more stark way makes this a black and white problem. So if the free and open Indo-Pacific is designed to maintain a balance of power in Asia that based on rules we all abide by, you have to be careful not to make it so narrow in definition that you lose Korea or Vietnam. So I think to the extent Japan and Taiwan and Australia and India are talking to the administration about this, that'll be good because they'll encourage the administration to think about this dimension a little more seriously, and who knows, maybe even TPP.
And your sense, I mean, there's been some flirtations, right, with various comments about maybe thinking about headed back toward TPP and so on. Your sense of direction on that?
So in the positive camp, we have the president said we may rejoin TPP, but he also said a bunch of stuff, for example, about gun control and didn't do it. So, but that's something. The Secretary of Treasury said something. The 25 senators, Republican senators, sent a letter to the president saying we need to rejoin TPP. Ag, Chamber of Commerce, all the governors except one are keen to get back in. And it's not like we can just wait because with the TPP 11 that was just signed, with other agreements, U.S. agricultural exporters are going to start actually really hurting. And so I think the pressure will grow on the administration to do something. Not before the midterms, I would guess, but maybe before the end of this administration, maybe. The problem is the letters T, P, and P are toxic, so it's probably a marketing problem.
Right. Admiral, obviously, as you mentioned, you spent several years looking at sort of maritime defense issues with a tremendous amount of fidelity. So from your perspective, I mean, how should we be thinking about the Indo-Pacific strategy in that context, and specifically, how does Japan integrate into this, not only from a maritime defense perspective, but also from a maritime trade perspective, and your sense of what Japan is thinking when it looks at Taiwan on this issue, especially given how close you were in your final position?
Yes. So I can say easier than either economic relation or cultural relation between Taiwan and China. But security relation is a little bit different for me. So, your security strategically importance of Taiwan is increase to the China strategy, HAD strategy or something a lot, just now, and also the U.S. side, CSBA, typically CSBA said the Eurasia strategy, the first the archipelago strategy, something like that. In the defense strategy level, Taiwan is the center of the first island chain. Of the north sector, we have to defend and South sector other country, particularly the United States. But Taiwan is very important. But so narrow sense of the security relation between Taiwan and Japan, and very difficult. So not change to the Indo-Pacific and the strategy. But the broad sense of the security relation have a chance to the, so I wear tie in the presented by the Taiwan navies. So of course, I retired. I invited from the chief of the navy, and at that time, the Admiral Chin invited me. So I participate to the maritime security conference in Taiwan. So, and also HADO, how to cooperate to the multilateral issue. We can do the extract. And also, so I focused Taiwan Navy use the United States, the destroyer, or the United States and the P3. P3 is the Taiwan Air Force. So fundamental, the interoperable to the Japan and the US and Taiwan. So it's a very important.
Yeah.
So such kind of the further relation between Taiwan and Japan and the United States. So more cooperative. Such a just now, and the Indo-Pacific relation not so influence the security relations, only in economic and trading.
Right.
So, but Greenson said TPP. So Tsai administration interested in the TPP. It's very good sounds. So the TPP not only in economy but also the security purpose. So.
And just to follow up slightly on that, now obviously we have Japan largely in the driver's seat with the remnants, let's call it, of TPP.
Yeah.
And from your perspective, does that add a sort of additional component to how Japan is thinking about that economic infrastructure in the region from your point of view?
TPP?
Yeah.
So. Okay. I realizing the high level of the economic partnership is the benefit of the global economy as a whole, and the implications of the political and the security are also great. I think that the international community, including Japan and the US, should encourage those efforts of Taiwan. So I'd like to know that, and also the Tsai administration announced the new Southbound Strategy. Also directed to the same vector of the Indo-Pacific strategy. I think the possibility of the potential cooperation is also great, I think.
Mike, obviously, Taiwan's in an interesting position when it comes to the Indo-Pacific strategy. I think, generally, obviously, they've been welcoming of it, but I think they're also careful to sort of think about how to place themselves. But of course, President Tsai has this new Southbound Policy initiative, which is an overt recognition from her perspective, I think, that the previous administration had become too dependent, if you will, on China in terms of Taiwan's economic future. But of course, I think even the most ardent supporter of the new Southbound Policy recognizes it's not a replacement for trade with China. There's just not enough potential there. So how do you think they're looking at all this? And what ambition does Taiwan have in terms of finding ways to integrate itself into the Indo-Pacific strategy from your point of view?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is Dean Acheson's 1950 line, right? Where he drew the line Japan, on the outside of Taiwan. And of course, we know that unfortunately eventuated in the Korean War, and put the Seventh Fleet in between so that Chiang Kai-shek wouldn't attack, nor would Mao attack. I mean, it was an interesting experience there. So Taiwan looks at it and says, okay, are we inside or outside? I mean, that's one question. I think very much inside in most people's mind, but it is a question of where's the beef? What's this going to mean effectively? Professor Matsuda last week or so talked about Japan's dilemma of being the security dilemma, right? Are we going to be drugged into a war because China and Taiwan are going to go to war because we're part of the United States, or are we going to be abandoned by the United States? So there's all of that to worry about. The southbound policy, though, is very much an attempt by the Tsai administration to link itself and Taiwan's economy and politics with the region. You're right. Right now, I think it's 40% of Taiwan's exports go to China. I don't know what Japan's number is, but it's also Japan's leading partner. So neither of them can say, forget about it, right? That's the first thing. But how to develop a supply chain that doesn't go as much through China, I think that's the first point.
Right.
Can the supply chain go to Taiwan and then south or east? I mean, those are the questions that Taiwan is grappling with. For now, I think the southbound policy has been very good at people-to-people relations, students going back and forth, visitors going back and forth. On the ground, economic development is slower. It's always harder to do that. But Taiwan now has, I think, something like 30 kind of one-stop shopping places where if you're a Taiwanese business person, you want to go into Mumbai, you can go to this place and they can help you. And I think that's one sign of how serious they are about integrating into those economies. Those economies, though, also have the problem of looking over their shoulder at China and, am I going to get dinged for this? I think with Japan, some of the ways in which Taiwan is talking about is maybe as Japan, for example, would build railroads, Taiwan could be in the service sector for the railroads. So there are ways in which I don't think there's been much done on this level yet with Japan in southbound policy, but the Tsai administration has very complicated and detailed programs that are meant to integrate it with the southbound region and therefore be part of that regional mix.
And of course, the Tsai administration is also, in its domestic economic development priorities, put some emphasis on indigenous defense development and so on. How do you see that sort of keying into the Indo-Pacific strategy? Is that part of the puzzle, or is this more about Taiwan's sort of securing Taiwan's future in terms of science and technology and so on, from your point of view?
I think the latter is a big part of it. Is Taiwan has to depend on the United States for its military hardware. Nobody else wants to sell or will.
Right.
So, and then at least over the past decade almost, it's been a push and pull process of getting arms flow regularly. So Taiwan wants to be able to have a sufficient a deterrent capacity. I must say, over the last 2 years, the U.S. DoD has been insistent, and the State Department, about you're not feeling the urgency. You, Taiwan, are not feeling the urgency of a short-term time frame for the Chinese possibility of attack. Right. Or you have to keep those generals in China saying, today is not the day. There's too much stuff lined up on the other side. Yeah. So I think President Tsai, you can see her wearing her helmet going around to visit field stations, taking part in things. She's very serious about upping the defense budget, but more importantly, what are we going to buy and what are we going to make? Right. There's a little bit of a tension there because she wants to make sure it can make as much with their own capabilities and not depend upon outside. But this short-term urgency question demands more sales from the United States. I think that's going to be in the pipeline now. Sure. So I think the other side of it, as you mentioned, is there's a big problem now for Taiwan of brain drain. Chinese can offer 5 times the salary, other places, these people that are professionals. So how do you keep that talent in the mix? One way is to have kind of dual use defense issues, right? Yeah. You're helping develop the weapon system, but at the same time, you're doing stuff which is available to perhaps corporate entities, future building of Taiwan's IT capabilities and stuff like that. So you get people to come in, work in the defense industries, but also have a foot perhaps in the corporate world. So it's both those things, I think.
Great. Let's talk about the sort of elephant in the room, which is China's rise and how to deal with that. Mike, you mentioned that your view is that the national security document and the national security strategy and defense documents are honest in sort of characterizing what we're finding with China. And obviously there's a huge debate now about was the engagement policy wrong-headed and this sort of thing. I think what we can say is with this week's developments in terms of Xi Jinping probably being around for a while, maybe a really long while, and with that sort of linked into that is the idea of China becoming, parentheses, even more authoritarian in direction. Let's talk a little bit about the values piece, because I know that's something that you personally are very focused on and think about a lot, and maybe sometimes wasn't in those documents as much as we would have liked, and especially with these three countries that we're discussing today, where we share those democratic values and so on. Your thoughts on that? How we should be mobilizing?
Well, very typically, certainly when I was a graduate student in international relations theory, realists were mostly anti-Wilsonian. So my professors were all students of Hans Morgenthau at the University of Chicago, who was alive during Wilson, and like Henry Kissinger and a lot of realists hated the idealism and taught us across the street at SAIS in the 80s that there's either there's national interest and realpolitik, or there's values, but they're separate. And in the 80s, mid 80s, my Asian studies professors also taught we can't impose Western values, Asians like authoritarian systems, yada, yada, yada. And then in, 1980, 88, 89, Taiwan, Philippines, Korea, all democratized. Wait a minute, what we were taught is not quite right. And historically, democratic values have been incredibly important to security for a whole bunch of reasons. And in my book, I talk about Thomas Jefferson, Perry, and others in the 18th, 19th centuries, arguing that since the United States was not an empire, we weren't going to build colonies. How could we make sure that other empires didn't colonize, especially Asia, where the Qing Empire was collapsing? And the answer was, if these are well-governed republics, they'll be more resilient to this coercion. And I think that basic truth, which Jefferson, Mahan, and others argued, over 100 years ago, is especially true now. If countries in Asia are well-governed and resilient and resistant to corruption and transparent and have rule of law, then they're not going to be bribed into buying lousy bullet trains from China that might crash. They're going to scrutinize it, and if China sells good stuff, great, more power to them. And if China invests in infrastructure, great, there's not enough supply of funding for infrastructure. But let's shed light. And the best way to shed light is by supporting rule of law and transparency and accountability. So it's also important because Americans are much more likely to fight and die to save fellow democracies. That's all the polls show that. And so I think it's very, very important and frankly a missing part of the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy that the President of the United States and the Secretary of State and others say these values really matter to us, because it will show we're committed to the security of like-minded states. It'll inform our support for their governance and rule of law. And it's not about containing China, it's about who do we stand by and why, and how do we help states resist imperialism. The same, not exactly the same imperialism as we were worried about in Asia in the 19th century, but not that different in some ways, the way the Belt and Road is working. So it's an important part of this, and I think there are people in the administration who clearly believe this, like Mike Pence and others. The president, it's hard to say. I mean, this meeting with Kim Jong-un bothers me for that reason more than any other. But it is a critical part of our strategy.
Just a brief follow-up, looking a little bit more at the Hans Morgenthau side of the equation, obviously, not to toot our own horn at CSIS, but we got onto the maritime piece with the islands quite early and established the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative, which I think has done what it was supposed to do, which was shed a lot of light on that situation. We're talking about continuity in Chinese policy under Xi Jinping now for some time. Obviously, there's an argument out there that basically says China won on the South China Sea, and in fact aren't receiving a lot of pushback, and now it's on to sort of next stages. Your sense of how we should be looking at that problem? Do we move on and try to focus on defense in the East China Sea? Do we try to roll back China's gains there, which of course would mean getting very much in their grill? Your thoughts on that?
So I think tactically, if you will, or in that sector, China definitely scored a touchdown with the militarization of the islands and paid no tactical cost. Freedom of navigation operations are an important demonstration of our principles and our willpower, but it doesn't hurt China. On the other hand, more broadly, you could argue that the Quad, the U.S., Japan, Australia, India meetings that have started happening, the closer alignment of Japan and India, of Australia, look at Australia's white paper, which focuses on these maritime partnerships. All of that was a strategic blowback from what China did in the South China Sea. So maybe it's a draw overall.
Right.
They within the region, they definitely had points and scored a touchdown, but they probably lost
Right.
a bit more broadly. I think Admiral Yoshida mentioned the first island chain, which is what will ultimately force the U.S. and Japan and Taiwan to have much more intimate intelligence sharing and relations, with the caveat that it's not an alliance and there will be many political and economic and constitutional barriers. But in the 1995-96 Taiwan Straits crisis, the U.S. was able to send 2 carrier battle groups with impunity through the South China Sea to demonstrate our willpower, but also to show, in effect, that we could flank China on the south and towards Hainan if they messed with us in Taiwan. That's much harder today. And now the PLA is operating on the Pacific side of Taiwan and the Pacific side of Japan. And we can no longer think of the first island chain as separate Taiwan, East China Sea, South China Sea theaters.
Right.
The PLA clearly looks at it as one integrated
whole.
problem. And it's easier for them because there's just one of them.
Right.
Whereas we have the U.S.-Japan Alliance, U.S.-Philippine Alliance, Taiwan Relations Act, they're all separate. And in any crisis, even if there's no shooting, you can be sure the PLA will try to exploit those seams. And we need to think a lot harder than we have about how do we close those seams. And it could be, for example, I think Taiwan will probably be well positioned to do a lot more smart mines, and Japan too. So, how can the U.S. Navy talk to both Japan and Taiwan about, demarcation and doctrine and technology? They may be. John Hamre here has us to continue touting CSIS's horn. The president of CSIS has this concept of federated defense. It's not NATO. It's not one alliance. Nobody wants to do that. We all trade with China. But in terms of capabilities, if we had to operate with fewer seams in a crisis, we could. Even if it never goes to shooting, the fact that we could is an important deterrent.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
But right now, we can't.
Right, and that's the sort of hard military side, but of course there's also a diplomatic side, and I think it's important to think about the fact that China also has a strategy on that side as well, and one of those areas, Yoshida-san, is this idea of a general soft but progressively warmer relationship between Beijing and Tokyo, actually. And in fact, we're hearing very strong rumors about an exchange of summit visits this year. We'll see if it actually comes off. I'm a bit skeptical, but there does seem to be interest, certainly in both sides. And it'd be the first time in more than a decade that would happen. So your thoughts on how that affects this equation that we're looking at?
Okay, so Green-san mentioned that U.S. and national security strategy or national defense strategy drastically changed under the Trump administration. But I'd like to say the Abe administration policy toward China had been consistent and has not changed. Regarding Japan-China relation, we did not compromise on territorial sovereignty or strategic interest at all. At the same time, we deal calmly with the individual problems as a responsible big country and maintaining a positive effort to improve relations. Also, based on further deepening of the strong Japan-U.S. alliance, we will strategically develop. So very difficult to transport the English. Diplomacy that takes panoramic perspective of the world map with the friendly nations. We will balance Chinese expansionist behavior and increasing the presence. The free and open Indo-Pacific strategy is a good example, I think. We will balance Chinese expansionist and on the other hand, China has been consistently reluctant to improve relations. But recently, China has a positive attitude toward improving relations. And I think there are 4 reasons why. First, President Xi Jinping has established domestic political power. Second, Xi has begun to challenge the U.S. alliance network in East Asia and form a favorable order for China. Third, the U.S. has begun to view China as a strategic competitor. And final, the Abe administration is a strong government. Therefore, Japan will continue to maintain a consistent position while taking the opportunity to change the attitude of the Chinese side to improve relations with China. This will aim to maximize the interest of Japan, allies, and friends. It is exactly the same for Taiwan. It's my view.
Great, thank you. Sticking to the China Rising theme, Mike, there was a lot of speculation even before the 19th Party Congress last fall that if Xi Jinping became even more powerful, maybe this would have some effect on China's approach, generally perceived, I think, as an adverse effect, the desire to build his legacy by having reunification occur during his watch. He needs something big, if you will. And there's a lot of this, obviously, in the Chinese domestic propaganda output as well, in breaking Chinese sort of history since the founding of the PRC into these three periods of Mao's accomplishments, the reform era, and then the super Xi Jinping era, as I like to call it, or the new era, as he calls it. Obviously, really at the end of the day, I think we haven't seen it yet. There's been no massive tonal changes, and yet we know he's going to be around for the foreseeable future. And do you think that sort of adds some weight to this idea that whether it's 2021 or some point beyond that, that there's more pressure? And how is Taiwan, most importantly, thinking about this? I mean, did they believe it, I guess, is the bigger issue. My perspective from my recent visits there has been they're a little skeptical. And in fact, they think, if anything, maybe, depending on some electoral results in Taiwan and so on, the PRC may in fact decide it has to actually deal with the Thai government. So you're sort of thinking about how all that fits in.
Yeah, it's a big conundrum for Taiwan, obviously. I think what China hopes, and Xi Jinping hopes, is they can use inducements, the sweeteners. They have these 31, forget what they're, conditions or conditionalities, where they're trying to get young Taiwanese to come. They have offering tax incentives, payment incentives, opportunities. So that's hard to miss when the economy is not yet taken off in those directions in Taiwan. So I think there's always that. I think that's the direction that Xi will try, because as we've already talked about, if they were to attack forcibly or even do heavy economic embargo of some kind, it would just shake everybody else is already shaken about what China's about, right? So I think they're willing to take their time to get to the Great China Rejuvenation mode by doing these kind of economic efforts. So that's the question of, is size 5+2 major project programs, the Southbound Policy, better links to Japan, is that going to be enough to balance off the kind of inducements? Will there be a possibility of the CPTPP allowing Taiwan to come in? And that means Taiwan's going to have to do something about pork and beef for the United States. It's going to have to do something about food safety. Those are big issues. So I think Taiwan's kind of caught here in the middle. I don't think there's an immediate concern about military attack, although that's why they're building up the defense lines. I think the other thing that most people don't realize is U.S.-Taiwan mill-to-mill relations are very deep and broad, and they keep going, trying to close those seams, try to get, when the carrier groups came in '96 and the U.S. planes went up and the Taiwanese planes went up, they couldn't talk to each other. Hey, we're going to shoot each other down, right? So now I think there's more and more of that kind of interoperability, and I presume quietly with Japan as well, but the seams are still there. So I think the steps are being taken, but it's not clear where President Xi will be pushed to go by his own demands, by his internal pressures. There's a lot of variations here that I don't see clearly. Right. And I think Taiwan is trying to bounce between those two.
Sure, yeah. And of course, the mainland side is very opaque, and increasingly in a situation where there's really only one voice that matters. It's difficult, to sort of understand what that one voice is thinking. If I may, what's the risk on the Taiwan side that President Tsai has what I would call a Chen Shuibian moment, where she basically decides enough of this. I've been trying, even this recent effort with using simplified characters and so on. I mean, really trying to go out of her way to show an extended hand and so on. And let's say the Vatican switches recognition, or some other sort of relatively significant shock happens. What's the prospect that she just says enough and goes in a different direction that could provoke the mainland, and how do we manage that?
I think there's several problems that Tsai faces. The economy has to grow. Okay, she has to satisfy the domestic constituency for that. She has to be able to develop this defense industry so that there can be stuff online that shows the willingness to hold up. But I think the question then is, she faces something which comes off being a nice, free and open democracy, which is there's a lot of United Front activity from the Chinese, a lot. And of course, the KMT is not sitting there quietly twiddling their thumbs. They believe, I don't believe it, but they believe that ultimately there should be unification. So if they have to throw a monkey in that wrench of moving towards independence, I think they're willing. Some people are willing, not everybody. So there's a real question now about how far Tsai can go. I think for her, personally, as presidential candidate in 2020, KMT is pretty weak right now. One of the things that has happened is there's been a number of laws put in place trying to recapture the assets that were stolen, basically, by the KMT during that takeover period. KMT never saw much distinction between the party and the state, right? Unlike CCP, of course. So they appropriate all those assets that were Japanese territory. They lived off them for a long time. Now they're being retaken. And that creates a weakness in their structural ability. I think it's also a weakness in their candidates. They have still a fairly old central committee kind of apparatus, but not much on the local level. So I think for this next period, Tsai is probably okay. But the question of it on the ground in the various municipalities, what's going to happen, that's happening this end of this year.
Right.
So bottom line is, I think she won't have a Chen Shuibian moment. She's been adamant about maintaining the status quo.
Yeah.
Won't be provocative, but we won't bow either to pressure. So I think that's been appreciated very much by the United States, and it's very supportive of her in that position. Keeping to that line has been hard.
Yeah.
But I think she will. And I don't think she will need to have a Chen Shuibian moment, which is basically, I'm going to lose this election unless I do something crazy like have a referendum on unification, and boom.
Yeah.
I told Jim Moriarty recently, I said, you and I have both lived through tough times, because he was, of course, in National Security Council, and I was working for DPP. We don't want to go back there, that's for sure.
I was just going to say, I think the lesson has been learned.
Yeah.
The scars are there,
Yes.
including on Tsai one's back from that, and Joey ran a lot of other people who lived through that, Mike. But also, I think Chen Shuibian did not read Washington properly.
That's right. That's
And part of my job at the time was to fix that. I think Tsai Ing-wen reads Washington pretty well.
Very well.
And frankly, once Chen figured out the consequences in relations with Washington, in my view, he changed.
Yeah, fair enough.
That's true.
So we should be in a much different place, and their personalities are very different as well.
And I think we have to give her a lot of credit for doing what she said, which has been to stay very steady on the issue, as you say, Mike, despite tremendous pressure. So
Yeah, as you know, 2011 she came here as the candidate, and the U.S. still was thinking of her as Chen Shui-bian's kind of surrogate. And she, they had the statement from the State Department saying, we met with her, we have distinct doubts that she's able to maintain, willing or able to maintain the current peace and security. So when she came in 2015, it was a very different mood.
Right.
We had a chance to meet with people. She can sell herself very easily just because she is what she is, a sophisticated professional woman who knows what she's talking about. And I think that's why the difference in the relations these days.
Great, thanks. Okay, well, that's enough babble from us. We're going to turn now to our audience. As usual, per CSIS procedure, if you would raise your hand if you have a question, wait to be called on, wait for the microphone to get to you for our online listeners, and please do identify yourself and your organization. And we have an eager person right here, so you're first up. So please wait for the microphone.
Thanks, and thanks for a great presentation. Leo Bosner, I'm a researcher with the Global Taiwan Institute. My question is about Chinese influence in universities. This has been an issue lately in the US, in Australia, and England, where the Chinese soft money has been seen to be pressuring universities to sort of gear their academic discussions, gear the course, et cetera, toward being more pro-China. Has this been an issue in Japan or in Taiwan, I'm wondering?
Something in Japan?
Well, it is an issue in Japan. And frankly, in the US, people didn't know it was an issue really until recently.
Right.
My own personal view, I teach at Georgetown, We were in the press recently because the Chinese Student and Scholars Association got $800 a semester from the Chinese embassy. I think the Chinese United Front activities in American, Australian, Taiwan, and Japanese universities are much greater than they were a few years ago, much greater than we thought, but not as dramatic as some of the coverage would suggest. And in the US, we have to be careful about civil liberties and careful not to overreact. But we need to be aware that this United Front activity is much more pronounced than it was. My own view is that the universities should be aware of it and police themselves. The US, SAIS, Georgetown, University of Texas have been in the press. There's very little Japanese press about this, I find. Maybe I'm missing something, but the same thing's happening in Japan. And there are problems with Confucius Institutes. Chinese professors at Japanese universities have gone home for a break and and had most unpleasant tea with the Ministry of State Security, as have their families. There's a lot of pressure on Japanese universities too, and I'll let Mike speak to Taiwan, but I think it is one of those issues where we should all, the open free society should be comparing notes. I don't think we want to overreact.
Yeah.
I mean, I like having students from China. Mm-hmm. They're dynamic, they're interested, and let's face it, a lot of the best Chinese students want to go to Georgetown or Harvard or, Waseda, so we should encourage that. We shouldn't overreact, but there's definitely more of an issue than people realize, including in Japan.
Taiwan has an additional issue, which is its population is shrinking rapidly. Got universities that have less and less students, so they want more students.
Yeah.
Where do they get them? China wants to come. That's where the Southbound Policy, they're trying to attract more people, but I don't think at this point that's going to make up for the difference. So it's a problem here too. A lot of money comes in from those students. Thank you very much. So that's one question. I think the other question is there is significant United Front activity, and everybody knows it. How much of it's university-based is another question, but I'll tell you this. I walked into the Ministry of Foreign Affairs up the steps in Taiwan. I heard some shouting. I turned around. There were 6 PRC flags across the street with the Unification Party of the White Wolf out there. And it's a democracy, so okay, you got a right to yell.
Things happen.
How does that work internally in student life? That's a different question. It's there. I don't know of any great incidents that have provoked uproar, but I think it's got to be looked at.
Yeah, if I may, I think Mike's point about not overreacting is very important. I think one of the challenges we increasingly see, though, is as it becomes harder and harder with the direction Xi Jinping's been following domestically in China to separate the notion of China from the notion of the Communist Party of China, that makes it harder and harder for universities, I think. In the past, they could kind of have a fig leaf and say, well, I do China. I know the CCP is bad, but I do China, and that's space is diminishing rapidly. Not only that, all Chinese institutions are under orders to make sure that that message is very clear, and I think we see a decided shift post the 19th Party Congress to this sort of idea of, from the Chinese perspective, the Communist Party is working for us and it's going to stay around for a long time, and we need to socialize other people to the fact of its enduring stability, and I think that then will make these issues more apparent, but again, the key is not overreacting. Next question, please. Yep, right up here in the front. Please wait for the microphone.
Hi, Nadia Chow, Washington correspondent for Liberty Time. Chris, since you mentioned Xi Jinping, just want to pick up your brain, the new constitution, with the Xi Jinping's new image as the, emerging dictator, what kind of impact will that be on the Western's point of view on China? For other panelists, we saw more article in the U.S. saying that U.S. has got China wrong for the past 20 decades, but there's so many bright people here. How could you get wrong? I mean, is that oversimplified, or do you have your own explanation? Thank you.
As to the Xi Jinping question, I'd encourage you to come again on Thursday morning when we'll be talking about this and the Liang Hui.
This is one big promo.
In short, I think one thing we've seen about Xi Jinping since he arrived on the scene is he puts a lot of stock in keeping the other people in the party off balance and trying to figure out what his next move will be and so Some of this, I think, is very consistent with that. Some of it, I think, is consistent with his penchant for what I call putting an exclamation point on his various approaches to things. So, for example, there's been a lot of murmuring, really, in Chinese elite circles after the Party Congress. Well, we didn't solve the succession problem. So, in a way, this is him saying, "I just solved it. There won't be a succession anytime soon." So, I think this is very consistent with his past behavior. I have to say I'm not surprised by it. Perhaps I'm disappointed by it in terms of what I thought might happen. But it is a significant development. And don't be surprised if come 2020 he decides to leave. I mean, part of this game for him is always the idea of balancing everybody off against each other. This is the Maoist element of his personality, which is, constant turmoil. And so the other piece that I think is significant in it is to look at this puts, to some degree, to the degree there is any opposition in the Chinese system, an even bigger target on him, which I would argue in this sort of realm of contradictions in dialectical thinking will cause him to want to rattle the system even more radically. So that's where the volatility comes in for all of us, I think. But
So I'm not sure we the United States or Japan or any other country, quote unquote, got China wrong. I don't buy that argument. For my book, I interviewed at some length some of the architects of normalization and an opening, Brzezinski, Kissinger, Howard Brown, and others. None of them thought in the 70s that we were going to democratize China or we were going to integrate China. That wasn't their goal. The United States was on its back after Vietnam. The Soviets were expanding, and we needed China to not be weak. The interesting thing when you talk to these senior people who were involved at the time was that they thought China was weak, and that weakness created an imbalance, a vacuum, and the Soviets were going to expand. That was the thinking, not we have this long-term strategy to democratize China. I think what we got wrong, or not me, not Chris, I think what certain other think tanks got wrong was Xi Jinping. I think that's fundamentally what people didn't anticipate, that he would emerge to be this kind of authoritarian leader or tout an anti-Western, frankly, anti-democratic, anti-alliance, anti-American alliance line. But frankly, some of the best minds in China, in universities and the leadership, got it wrong, don't you think?
Yes.
So that's what we got wrong with Xi Jinping. And as Chris points out, maybe we still don't quite have him right.
Yeah.
We certainly all have to be much more on our guard, though. We can't keep doing the same exact thing we were doing. But I don't think this idea of engagement was wrong. What would we do instead of engagement?
Right.
And what would we do now? So it's a little bit of an artificial choice. We just have to be a little smarter, actually a lot smarter, and deal with a different kind of leader in a different system than a few years ago was possible. And didn't turn out to be that way, at least for now.
Yeah. Mike?
It seems to me one area where we collectively got it wrong was that by entering, I think this was the Clinton approach, Bill Clinton, get him in the WTO,
Right.
get him to be integrated into the system, and they're not going to democratize necessarily right away, but they're going to get their economy moving in a different direction. It's going to be a middle class, and that's going to bring change. Well, they got moving in a different direction, but the CCP kept control. Right. And they accumulated lots of money because of it, and I think that's where the pushback has to come now. Mm-hmm. Go by the rules. And I think on the economic front, we haven't forced them enough to come by what WTO rules, and they've been able to do what they've spun up real well, which is draw up fairly significant reserves, get a lot of money, and then start throwing it around. So I think, at least from what I saw in the late 90s to the 2000s, was this attempt to get China into the game, and then it was going to change towards a democracy.
And I think we can't overemphasize enough the role of technology has played in this as well, and the fact that China in fact discovered that if you have enough market power and enough people, you can indeed decouple from the global internet and do just fine. Thank you, at least in the short term. In the middle there, yep.
Yoshi Komori of the Sankei Shimbun, Japan. With all due respect to what Dr. Green just said, currently I still hear often there's a bipartisan pronouncement for the failure of the American engagement policy toward People's Republic of China. So twisting this line of argument, that the question I'd like to ask you, Mike, or the others, is what implications, if any, that this so-called failure, perceived or real, we'll have the future American policy or a future Trump administration's policy toward Taiwan, you know?
Well, for 25 years, I've been saying the same thing, which is strengthen our alliances, strengthen our support for Taiwan, network our alliances, do free trade, stand up for human rights and democracy. So, and I think there are a lot of people in this town, I will hardly claim to be the only one, who've been saying the same thing for a long time. And a lot of the people who are saying engagement failed had a somewhat more optimistic view of China, I'll grant that. I don't know what other strategy people would propose. So if people, so a handful of people in some think tanks want to contain China, what does that mean? What does that mean? If we're worried about China asserting a hegemonic control over Asia, why would we institute a containment policy that will be impossible for countries like Indonesia or Korea or Vietnam to follow? We have to have a strategy where the pillars, which is why the Quad comes in, but especially the US, Japan, and Australia, are deeper and tighter and more networked. Then build networks beyond that, and we need to be inclusive. We don't want to be exclusive and focus on containing China because we'll lose countries that we need to maintain a balance of power. We need our core alliances to be able to fight and win, especially US, Japan, if China uses force. We need to then stand up for, we now, the United States and Japan, are on the side of self-determination in Asia. It wasn't always so. In the Vietnam War, a lot of people criticized the US for standing with the Europeans. And in fact, we got into the Vietnam War standing up for France. Or even in World War II, we were criticized for helping the British who had empires. We've not always been seen as standing for self-determination and resistance against hegemonic threats. Now we are clearly, the US and Japan, on the side of small middle powers being able to determine their own futures. We'll give them a hard time about human rights and democracy, but we're not going to coerce them in the way China is right now in the South China Sea or in the Himalayan mountains. That's our trump card, so to speak, and we can build a strategy around that. But if we try to be exclusive and ignore the interests of all these small and medium powers, we'll find ourselves on the wrong side of history, as the Chinese say. I think in Washington there's a pretty broad recognition, even though there's a debate about whether it was a mistake to engage China or not. I think on the way forward, panelists may disagree, but I think there's a much broader consensus on what we need to do in broad terms than there ever has been. Within the administration, there are huge debates about, Section 301 and can we resort to sanctions and debates about the tools, but I don't see any I don't see any possibility of a containment strategy getting any legs with the American public or the Congress. Balance of power, the polls show, Chicago Council, the American public a few years ago was asked what should we do about China, contain China. A small number said yes. Accommodate China, a small number said yes. The overwhelming majority of Americans answered strengthen our alliances and partnerships to counterbalance China. I think that's a fairly strong consensus. That may not have answered your question, but you can grill me after.
I think it's also important that Taiwan is not anti-China, okay, per se. It can't be for once and for trade, if no doubt. And the TPP is not anti-China. It's pro-Taiwan, okay? So how do they effectuate that within the strategy? And I think that's where they have to grab some of the free trade problems that they have. It's not just the food issues, although those are there. There are regulatory issues. There are other ways in which they weren't probably going to even get into the TPP as it originally was conceived, whether they can get into TPP 11 or whatever it's called, CPTPP, or future things. It's up to Taiwan to make some moves, I think, and that's where they have to go.
Next question. Sir. Just wait for the mic, please. Thanks.
I'm Atsujo Ohara, professor of University of Nagasaki, Japan. I'm asking that in the near future, maybe China economy is close to the US economy. My specific question is the role of China in international organizations like World Bank and IMF, since that basically based on the GDP size reflect to futures voting rights in the IMF and the World Bank.
Well, the first thing I would say is, whatever our policy on China's participation in international organizations that China is not currently in, like the OECD, for example. Whatever our policy is, we have to have a parallel policy to protect and maximize Taiwan's international space and participation in all the same organizations. One can't go without the other. And then the second thing I would say about China is, this is a really hard question. I think it's a legitimate debate. So for example, on foreign aid, China is not very transparent. Some people have proposed letting China into the donors, the DAC, the donors, what I forgot what the A is, advisory committee or something on of the OECD, so that there is a incentive for China to share data. On that one, on the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, International Energy Agency, which flows from it, I'm a bit of a hardliner. I think you need to be a democratic and transparency society to be in those organizations, and I would stick to that. And there are probably ways to have association and mechanisms for cooperation with China, but I would maintain the core. G20 is fine, but I would keep the G7 as very, very important. I would keep the OECD. I think, especially when we have revisionist powers of various kinds, those core democratically oriented institutions should be preserved. And then we'll find other ways to expand cooperation. In the UN or the World Bank, of course, China can do more than in the OECD, but it's a hard question. I think we're going to have to case by case that one, but I'm for preserving the ones that we know share common democratic values.
Taiwan has a particular problem in international organizations, of course. The United States does not recognize Taiwan as a sovereign country, but it doesn't recognize PRC's control of Taiwan or PRC sovereignty over Taiwan. So it's in this kind of netherland. And so what the US has done significantly is to be very supportive of Taiwan's participation, meaningful participation at least in WHO, meaningful participation in ICAO, the Civil Aviation Organization. Given the leadership has been Chinese in those organizations recently, pretty hard to get over that bar. What the United States has done, and very effectively as far as Taiwan is concerned, it's called a Global Cooperative and Training Framework, where the United States and Taiwan jointly sponsor a wide range of technical meetings in Taiwan, and they invite people from the whole region to come, and they're on like mosquito-borne illnesses, or women's equality, or women's empowerment, or issues, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, things which Taiwan has good resources for, can make itself a player, but doesn't have to reach the statehood level that UN demands. So the US has been very supportive of Taiwan in those instances. I wish more could be done, but there is this barrier about officiality.
Yoshida-san, Japan obviously was really one of the few countries to sort of stand with the US on the AIB issue when it first came up, and yet now they seem to be sort of softening a little bit. Japan's perspective on these international organizations, I presume they tend to lean toward Mike's point of view in terms of the democratic values piece, your sense of that?
Your question about international organization.
Yeah, right.
So, it's a simple and difficult question for me. Yeah, so my experiences are the last 2 years. So the face to the Chinese POA expansion to the front line. So, but to here for 3 years ago, so I think were so more. How can I say? More high positions, the view of the world.
Right.
So the very I think so. Maybe Chinese the goal is prevent the situation where the United States, Japan, Taiwan, and others collaboration to confront China,
right,
and drive this alliance as much as possible. So, but I entered the Navy at the end of the Cold War era. So at the time, the containment to the Soviet. So the very simple strategy. But Chinese are very difficulty, not containment, not engagement. So the McMaster said, competitive engagement.
Right.
And also, something competitive means so that short track race,
Right.
yeah, not short track race, long marathon, no goal marathon.
Right.
So maybe just United States, the top. Maybe the military power, second rank is Russia.
Yeah.
The third China. But 2025, maybe second and the third can change. But alliance and keep the gap of the top to the second.
Right.
So it's a very difficult strategy and more. So I have to get the idea. I think.
Good. Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Sir, please wait for the microphone.
My name is Kunio Kikuchi, and ex-World Bank and a consultant now here. I'd like to bring the question or the back to where Mike was just a while ago about perception of China and Xi Jinping. And you said that you haven't really changed anything. You have promoted the same thing vis-a-vis Taiwan, United States, China, so forth. But I now have more time to listen to CNN, for example. And it seems things are different. Here you have Mr. Xi Jinping, there you have Mr. Putin, and here we have Mr. Trump. And if I were a Japanese person sitting in Japan, looking at the three leaders and the way they behave and how the US is being pestered by these scandals and everything else at the leadership, I would wonder if we should keep the same kind of attitude towards China and towards the United States in the long race that you just mentioned. And I'm wondering what you think about that, because you talk as though nothing has changed a few blocks down on the
No, I don't
White
think
House.
that at all.
Thank you.
What I was saying was my argument of what U.S. strategy should be hasn't changed, and I don't think I'd put Rich Armitage or Joe Nye or Kirk Campbell, a lot of people in that category. That's what I'm saying. I think the problem is much more complicated, and Xi Jinping is much more authoritarian and I would use the word expansionist, at least rhetorically and in many dimensions than people anticipated. So the problem's harder, but the strategy, the basic direction of our strategy was right. We just have to be better at it. We have to, and so to your second question, if I were in Tokyo, I was just in Tokyo, would I be worried about Mr. Trump? Well, yeah. I mean, the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy is good. It's very much oriented towards Japan and alliances. President Trump's relationship with Abe is really good. They've talked. I think they've probably talked more already than Abe talked to Obama on the phone the whole time, and that's good. But the decision making on this North Korea summit was well, I'll tell you candidly. Although the Japanese government can't show that it's worried about it, it was worrying. The decision making on steel and aluminum, that was worrying. You know, these alliances, and it's true for Taiwan, are based on a web of networks and an understanding of strategy and people who speak for the president and the prime minister. And even though the president's relationship with Prime Minister Abe is apparently very good, and the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy and national security strategy are quite favorable for Japan, the decision-making process clearly has people rattled everywhere, and I'll include myself in that. Public opinion polls these days in Japan tend to show strong support for the alliance, but when asked, do you trust the US, the numbers aren't great, frankly. So where are you going to go? I mean, somebody in Japan said to me, oh, if this keeps it up, we're going to have to hedge against the US. I said, oh dear, what are you going to do? We're going to strengthen our ties with India and Australia. Okay. That was, as I recall, that was the Jeb Bush strategy and Marco Rubio strategy and George Bush strategy. So I don't know, maybe Yoshida-san has a better option.
Okay, well, I think we'll end it there. Please join me in thanking our panelists for this great conversation.